talk a little bit about some history. The one-drop rule, as you may or may not know, a very old concept from way back in our history of America, or really the world. It's a larger concept than that, but it says that if you had one drop of black blood, then you or the person is really considered part of the black community, the black race. So that's really the history of what it was. Is it still here? That's kind of a rhetorical question. We can talk about it later. Interesting question, I think, the one drop. And so back on, you can look at census from the past, other data collection. That's really how they did it. If you had one part of black in you, if you were mixed as African American, then you were considered black. Loving versus Virginia, another pretty large historical concept in this arena. The Lovings were a couple, Richard and Mildred. This happened back in 1967. It happened in Virginia. Virginia had a law against interracial marriage. It actually violated the 14th Amendment, which ensured equal protection. So it officially overturned the previous ruling, this Loving v. Virginia, which is Pace versus Alabama, which were really laws in 16 states which still banned interracial marriage. That Loving versus Virginia overturned this law, and so it became illegal for states to not allow people to marry. So the Loving case won them their freedom to get married. 16 states from Delaware to Texas had laws banning interracial couples. It really, Loving made it illegal for the states to enforce the laws. It was on the books in lots of places in some iteration in 42 states over the course of history, if you count all of the laws together. And it didn't only apply to African American and white people. It applied to lots of different people of color, Asians, Native Americans, Hispanics, Latinos, other ethnic groups as well. But really, even though the law was overturned by the Supreme Court, it really actually stayed on the books in a lot of states longer than 1967. I'm going to quote from South Carolina. In 1998, a clause that prohibited marriage of a white person with a Negro or mulatto or a person who shall have 1/8 or more Negro blood was removed from their state constitution. And that was in 1998. Another state that still had this on the books was Alabama, and that wasn't released or removed until the year 2000. There was a referendum that was passed that removed the article from their state constitution, saying the legislature shall never pass any law to authorize or legalize any marriage between any white person and a Negro or a descendant of a Negro. So that was their clause in the Alabama state constitution. So since 1967, you can kind of see the history that's really ingrained in the fabric of America, that we had in our states that people could not intermarry racially. And so we're still dealing with a lot of that in a lot of other arenas like LGBTQ arenas as well. But this gives you some of the racial background of people being able to marry. Since 2004, people have gathered on June 13th to celebrate Loving Day. Loving Day, they actually have a website as well. I think it's lovingday.org if that's something you're interested in looking at. So moving on into identity specifically, I wanted to start this section by saying that I believe that race matters. I believe that there is a lot of research out there on various populations, people of color, lots of information and research out there about how we retain students, how students succeed academically. student organizations, physical spaces. We have lots of different centers on our campuses. All of those things really deal with people of color, students of color. Specifically, what seems to be missing across the board is the inclusion of multiracial students into this arena. There aren't a lot of centers for multiracial people, which I think would be the ultimate dream if we had enough students who would come and say, I need this service, I want to gather with people that identify as multiracial. That would be a very exciting day, I think, to many people. But we don't really include students in that category that are multiracial. And so I believe that race matters on a very large scale and then on a small scale as well. On the 2000 census, there were a number of students or a number of people who were under the age of 18, and that number is actually 40%. So 10 years ago, 40% of people who checked more than one box were under the age of 18. So what that means, I think, is that there's a larger population now being able to check more than one box. For some of those people, it may lead to an increase in their identity and assertion of their identity as multiracial, but it also means that that's a lot of people coming into college age, traditional 18 to 24, or you name it, that's a lot of people. For many students, identity-wise, physical appearance is really a large aspect. That almost calls up the one-drop rule in some sense for some students, but physical appearance, how we show up, how we walk into a room. If I, as a mixed student, walk into the Black Student Union group student meeting, do I get any questions? I'm very light-skinned. What does that mean? Does it mean anything? Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. But the research coming now, since 1990, is really when research on multiracial students in particular started really gaining momentum. And so what we've learned since this time over the last 10 years, 20 years or so, is that physical appearance is a really large factor for a lot of our mixed students on campus. Sometimes they experience resistance from monoracial students. Monoracial meaning one of one race. They may walk into a student organization, they may show up as a new student in a residence hall, maybe experiencing some different resistance from a roommate, from people asking them, so what are you? Oh, are you really going to join the Asian Students Association? Are you Asian? I'm not sure. And back to that question of what are you? So, and people may ask that question. There's probably 72 ways, I swear to you, that people will ask. So what are you? So what is your background? So nationality. So what do you check when you look at, you name it, there's probably lots of ways that people think they're being maybe polite in asking that question. And then peers really affect a lot of these students, their identity. If they find a group of students that may be multiracial as well, depending on how they identify, maybe they don't identify as mixed and so it's not really a big deal. But if they find friends that they can talk about their upbringing, their family, their background, their peers really affect how they view themselves. Family is a really big issue for many of these students, as you probably can imagine. So multiracial meaning most likely growing up with a parent of each race or different races or multiple races. In their background. Sometimes both parents are present, sometimes they're not. That's a whole other issue as well, but how you grew up, what culture you were raised in. Do you embrace both sides of your racial background, or do you not? How did your family raise you? So research over the last, since